In a world dominated by technology and strict rules, what happens when compassion is forgotten? For Henry Sullivan, a loyal customer of 40 years, a trip to the bank to access life-saving funds for his wife became a nightmare. But then, Shaquille O'Neal arrived, transforming a moment of despair into a powerful stand for humanity. This isn't just a story about a basketball legend. It's about the difference one act of kindness can make. Stay with us for this unforgettable tale of resilience and redemption. The sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets as Henry Sullivan, a frail but determined 74-year-old veteran, shuffled toward the entrance of Centennial Savings Bank. His wooden cane tapped against the pavement with each step, a steady rhythm masking the urgency in his heart. Tucked under his arm was a well-worn envelope containing his veteran ID, Social Security letter, and decades of meticulously kept bank statements, proof of a lifetime of responsibility. Inside the bank, Henry was greeted by the cool hum of air conditioning and the faint murmur of customers conducting their daily business. The sleek modern interior, with its glass walls and digital kiosks, felt worlds apart from the humble branch Henry had grown accustomed to over his 40 years of loyalty to Centennial Savings. Approaching the counter, he greeted the young teller with a polite smile. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'd like to make a withdrawal from my account." The teller glanced at Henry, her expression cool and detached. "Do you have your digital ID and account access set up on our app?" Henry furrowed his brow. "Digital ID? I've got my veteran ID, my Social Security card, and all my bank records right here." He placed the envelope carefully on the counter, his arthritic fingers trembling slightly. The teller sighed, tapping her nails against the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but we've upgraded our systems. All accounts now require digital verification through our app. You'll need to have a smartphone to complete the process." Henry's face fell. "A smartphone? My wife and I don't use those fancy gadgets. We have a flip phone, and that's been more than enough for us." Her response was curt. "I'm afraid I can't help you without digital verification. It's corporate policy." Henry's heart sank as he tried to explain. "Miss, I've been banking here since 1983. Miss Hilda used to help me with my transactions every month. Surely you can look up my account. My savings are right there." The teller barely glanced at him. "I understand, but our policies are firm. No exceptions." As Henry's desperation grew, so did the volume of his voice. "Please, this is urgent. My wife needs her medication and I need to withdraw the money to pay for it before the pharmacy closes at 5. A few customers turned to watch the exchange, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. A young mother with a toddler clutched her child a little closer, while an elderly man shook his head in quiet disapproval. Henry reached into his envelope, pulling out the prescription slip. "Look here," he said, his voice cracking. "This is the medicine she needs. The new treatment isn't covered by insurance, and it costs nearly $500. I just need my money, my own money, own." The teller glanced at the prescription, then at Henry. Her face softened slightly, but her words didn't change. "I'm sorry, sir. Without the proper digital ID, I can't authorize the transaction." Henry's frustration boiled over. "You can't just let her go without her medication. This is my life savings we're talking about. What kind of bank denies a man access to his own money?" The bank manager, Emily Harris, emerged from her office, alerted by the rising tension. A young woman in her early 30s, Emily was known for her strict adherence to protocol. She approached the counter, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her tone firm but polite. The teller quickly explained the situation, and Emily turned to Henry. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand this is frustrating, but we have strict policies in place to ensure the security of our customers. These measures are designed to protect people like you from fraud." Henry's voice quivered with suppressed anger. "Protect me? From who? I've been coming to this bank longer than you've been alive. I don't need protection. I need my wife's medicine." Emily gestured toward her office. "Let's step inside and talk privately, Mr. Sullivan." The glass-walled office of Emily Harris was a study in modern corporate efficiency. A sleek mahogany desk dominated the space, adorned with a single tablet and a meticulously arranged stack of paperwork. The faint hum of the air conditioner filled the silence as Henry Sullivan, gripping his cane tightly, lowered himself into the chair opposite Emily. His face, lined with decades of hard work and sacrifice, betrayed a mix of frustration and desperation. Emily settled into her chair, her professional demeanor unshaken. At 32, she was the epitome of a rising corporate star, sharp, ambitious, and fiercely committed to protocol. She began typing swiftly, her gaze flickering between her screen and Henry's account information. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice measured and calm. "I understand you've been banking with us for a long time, but we've recently updated our security protocols. These changes are federally mandated, and they're designed to protect our customers from fraud." Henry's grip on his cane tightened, his knuckles whitening. "I don't need protection," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I need access to my money. I've banked here for over 40 years. I've always been careful. Never missed a payment, never overdrafted, never caused any trouble." Emily nodded, her expression softening slightly, though her words remained firm. "And I can see that. Your account history is impeccable, but our new system requires digital verification for all transactions. Without it, I'm unable to authorize access." Henry reached into the envelope he'd been carrying, pulling out his meticulously organized documents. His hands trembled as he laid them out on the desk. His veteran ID, social security card, a tattered birth certificate, and decades-old bank statements. "These papers should be enough," he insisted, his voice tinged with frustration. "They prove who I am. They've always been enough." Emily glanced at the papers, her eyes briefly lingering on the faded ink of the veteran ID. She hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sullivan, but physical documents are no longer sufficient. The system requires digital verification, including a smartphone app, biometric data, and two-factor authentication. It's all part of the bank's modernization process." Henry's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. "I don't have a smartphone," he said quietly. "Margaret and I have always gotten by with our old flip phone. We don't need anything fancy, just something that works." Emily's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she recalled the email from corporate headquarters earlier that morning. The directive had been clear: 0 exceptions to security protocols. Violations would result in an immediate review of management positions. Her job, her mortgage, her future in banking, all of it depended on perfect compliance. She took a deep breath and offered a suggestion. "Perhaps a family member could assist you with setting up the digital verification process. It typically takes just a few days to complete." Henry's eyes, filled with years of wisdom and worry, locked onto hers. "My son is stationed in Germany, and Margaret's sister is flying in next week to help care for her. But the medication—" He placed the prescription slip on her desk, his voice faltering. "It can't wait until next week." Emily glanced at the prescription, her heart sinking as she realized the urgency of his situation. She looked back at her screen, where a red banner blared across the top of his account. "Unverified account. Access restricted." The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each passing second bringing Henry closer to the pharmacy's closing time. Outside the office, a small crowd had gathered in the bank's lobby, their curiosity piqued by the scene unfolding. Many of them recognized Henry, Coach Sullivan, the man who had spent decades mentoring local kids, buying uniforms for those who couldn't afford them, and cheering from the sidelines long after his players had left the team. Emily noticed the growing attention, but pushed it aside. Her focus remained on the rigid policies she had been trained to enforce. "I wish there were more I could do," she said finally, her tone laced with professional sympathy. "But my hands are tied. These protocols exist to ensure the safety of all our customers." Henry's face fell, his hope slipping away. He gripped the edge of the desk, his voice trembling. "You think this is keeping me safe? I've spent my whole life working hard, saving every penny I could, and now, when I need it the most, you're telling me I can't have it because I don't own a smartphone?" Emily's resolve wavered, but she quickly steeled herself. "I understand how frustrating this is," she said, standing up and gesturing toward the door. "But without the proper digital credentials, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." Henry rose unsteadily, leaning heavily on his cane. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His dignity, so carefully maintained through decades of service and sacrifice, seemed to crumble as he shuffled out of her office. Back in the lobby, the security guards hovered nearby, ready to step in if Henry's frustration boiled over again. But he said nothing as he slowly made his way toward the bank's exit. His cane tapped against the marble floor, each step echoing like a punctuation mark on his despair. The gathered customers watched in silence, their expressions a mixture of pity and discomfort. A young mother whispered to her husband, while an elderly woman clutched her pearls, shaking her head. "This isn't right," she muttered. "It just isn't right." As Henry reached the bench outside the bank, his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. The envelope slipped from his grasp, its contents scattering onto the ground like fallen leaves. He made no move to gather them, too consumed by the weight of his failure. Inside her office, Emily watched from behind the glass walls, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. But the rigid policies of corporate compliance loomed large in her mind, silencing any thoughts of defiance. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Henry sat motionless, his weathered hands gripping his cane as tears welled in his eyes. And then, just as the weight of hopelessness seemed unbearable, a shadow fell across him. A deep voice, warm and full of kindness, broke through the silence. "Sir, are you okay?" Henry looked up, his teary eyes meeting the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal and his teenage daughter Alyssa standing before him. Startled by the towering figure before him, his first instinct was to straighten up, years of coaching discipline kicking in. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed his despair. "Just a little trouble at the bank, that's all." Alyssa, always quick to act, knelt down and began gathering Henry's scattered papers. "It doesn't look like a little trouble," she said softly, holding up the prescription slip. "This looks important." Henry hesitated before taking the papers from her. "It is," he admitted, his voice cracking. "My wife's medication. It's new, expensive, and not covered by insurance. I needed to withdraw money from my account to pay for it. But—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Shaq crouched down beside Henry, his enormous frame making the older man look even smaller. "But what, Coach?" he asked. Henry blinked, surprised. "How did you know I was a coach?" Alyssa, holding up one of the photos she'd picked up, grinned. "Dad, look! He's Coach Sullivan. We heard about him at camp. They said he was the guy who taught all the kids who couldn't afford to play, bought them uniforms, even gave them rides home after practice." Shaq's expression softened as he looked at the photo. It showed a younger Henry standing with a group of grinning basketball players, his arm slung around one of them. "I know about you, Coach," Shaq said, nodding. "They say you never turned away a kid who needed help." Henry gave a faint smile, though his eyes still glistened with tears. "I tried to do what I could," he said. "But today it seems the world's not as kind as it used to be." Henry explained his predicament, how he'd banked with Centennial Savings for over 40 years, how the new digital policies had locked him out of his own account, and how his wife Margaret's medication couldn't wait another day. Each word seemed to weigh heavier than the last. Shaq listened intently, his jaw tightening as Henry spoke. The mention of cancer and medication hit a deeply personal chord. Shaq's sister, Aisha, had passed away from cancer years earlier, and the memories of watching her fight the disease came rushing back. Alyssa, now standing beside her father, looked up at him. "Dad, this isn't right. We have to do something." Shaq nodded, his resolve firm. "You're right, Alyssa." He turned to Henry and extended a hand. "Coach Sullivan, let's go back inside. Sometimes people just need a little reminder that behind every policy, there's a person." Henry hesitated, unsure if he could face the humiliation again, but Shaq's steady presence and kind smile gave him the courage to try. He gripped Shaq's hand, and with Alyssa at his side, the three of them walked back toward the bank's entrance. Inside, the atmosphere shifted the moment they stepped through the glass doors. Conversations hushed, and heads turned as customers and employees recognized the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal. Phones appeared in hands, cameras discreetly pointed toward the unlikely trio. At the counter, the same teller who had dismissed Henry earlier froze mid-sentence. Her eyes darted nervously between Shaq and Henry. "Welcome, Mr. O'Neal," she stammered, her professionalism faltering. "How can we assist you today?" Shaq leaned on the counter, his voice calm but firm. You can start by explaining to me why this man, a loyal customer of over 40 years, can't access his own money to buy life-saving medication for his wife. The teller looked flustered, motioning toward the manager's office. Let me get Ms. Harris. She'll explain everything. Emily Harris, alerted to the commotion, stepped out of her office, her polished demeanor faltering when she saw Shaq. Her tablet trembled slightly in her hands as she approached. Mr. O'Neal, she said, her voice professional but strained. Is there an issue I can assist with? Shaq didn't mince words. The issue is your bank's policies. They're keeping this man from his money and, more importantly, from getting his wife the medication she needs. Emily glanced at Henry, her earlier encounter with him flashing in her mind. She took a deep breath, her corporate training kicking in. Mr. Sullivan's account requires digital verification. These protocols are federally mandated to protect against fraud. Stop, Shaq interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. I know how banking regulations work. I've sat on the boards of multiple banks. What I also know is that your system isn't protecting him. It's failing him. Behind them, the murmurs of customers grew louder, and Alyssa discreetly held her phone up, recording the interaction. Shaq's towering frame and calm but commanding presence seemed to fill the room, shifting the power dynamic in an instant. We're going to fix this right now, Shaq said, his deep voice reverberating across the lobby. Because if we don't, I'll personally help Coach Sullivan transfer every penny of his savings to a bank that remembers what community means. The tension in the room was palpable as Emily hesitated, weighing her options. She could see the phones recording, the growing interest from onlookers, and the clock ticking toward the pharmacy's closing time. For the first time in her career, she realized this was more than just a policy decision, it was a moral one. Shaq leaned slightly on the counter, his massive frame towering over Emily. His voice, though low, carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Protecting people from fraud is one thing. Denying them access to their own money is another. This man has been banking here for over 40 years. You can see his account history, can't you? Emily nodded hesitantly. Yes, Mr. Sullivan's account is in good standing, but without digital verification, I can't override the system. It's corporate policy. Shaq cut her off. Let me tell you something about policies, he said, his tone steady but sharp. Policies are meant to serve people, not the other way around. Right now, your policies are failing a man who's done nothing but trust this bank for decades. How does that make sense? The murmurs in the lobby grew louder, the tension palpable. One elderly customer whispered to her husband, "He's right. This whole thing is ridiculous." Another customer, a young man in a business suit, raised his phone higher to get a better shot of the exchange. Alyssa, standing beside her father, chimed in. "Dad, I read their online policies. It says they can use an emergency override for special cases. Isn't this a special case?" Emily's face flushed as Alyssa's words hit their mark. She glanced nervously at her tablet, recalling the override feature buried in their training manuals. It was rarely used and heavily monitored by corporate, but it existed. Shaq didn't miss the hesitation. "You're thinking about it, aren't you, the override?" He leaned in slightly, his voice softening but losing none of its weight. "Do the right thing, Ms. Harris. This isn't just about money. This is about a man trying to save his wife's life." Henry, who had been silent, finally spoke up. His voice was low but filled with emotion. "I don't want trouble. I just want to take care of Margaret. She's been my world for 50 years. Please don't let her suffer because I can't figure out a smartphone." Emily looked at Henry, then at Shaq, and finally at the crowd of onlookers whose faces reflected both judgment and expectation. The weight of their stares pressed down on her. Her corporate training had taught her to follow rules, but this moment felt different, like a test of her own humanity. Finally, she straightened her posture and gestured toward the glass-walled office. "Mr. Sullivan, Mr. O'Neal, please come with me. Let's resolve this." Shaq gave a nod of approval, placing a reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder. "Let's go, Coach. They're finally starting to see sense." Inside the office, Emily sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to activate an emergency override," she said, her voice tinged with both determination and apprehension. "It's not something we do often, but given the circumstances..." Henry's face lit up with hope for the first time that day. Thank you, Ms. Harris. I don't know how to repay you. Emily shook her head. Just let me make this right. The transaction finally completed, Emily handed Henry the cash he needed. Here you go, Mr. Sullivan. I'm truly sorry for all the trouble today. Henry took the money with trembling hands, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. O'Neal, for standing up for me. I don't know what I would have done without you. Shaq shook his hand firmly. You're not alone, Coach. Sometimes we all need someone in our corner. As they walked back into the lobby, the gathered crowd erupted into applause. Phones captured every moment as Shaq, Alyssa, and Henry exited the bank together. Outside, the golden light of the setting sun seemed to shine a little brighter, reflecting the quiet triumph of a man who had almost been forgotten but was now seen again. The applause from the bank's lobby followed Shaquille O'Neal, Alyssa, and Henry Sullivan as they stepped outside into the warm glow of the setting sun. Inside Centennial Savings Bank, the atmosphere remained tense. Bank manager Emily Harris stood by the glass doors, her tablet clutched tightly against her chest. Her polished demeanor wavered as the gravity of the situation began to settle in. She had made a choice, one that defied corporate policy. The emergency override she'd used to process Henry's withdrawal loomed in her mind, accompanied by the silent threat of a review from corporate headquarters. But something deeper stirred within her, the humanity in Henry's story, the quiet dignity of a man who had spent decades giving to his community, and the towering presence of Shaquille O'Neal had shaken her sense of certainty. As Shaq and Henry stood by the bench outside, Shaq's voice carried a calm authority. Coach, we got your wife's medication money. That's the important part, but this isn't over. Henry, clutching the envelope of cash tightly in his weathered hands, looked up at Shaq with gratitude but also hesitation. I don't want to cause trouble. They're just following their rules. Shaq shook his head, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the bench. Rules are important, Coach, but they're supposed to serve people, not block them. This isn't just about you. How many others are going through the same thing but don't have someone to stand up for them? Alyssa, still recording with her phone, nodded in agreement. He's right, Mr. Sullivan. I looked it up. There are thousands of seniors who've been locked out of their accounts because they can't meet these new digital requirements. Henry sighed, his shoulders sagging. It's not just me then. Back inside the bank, Emily watched through the glass, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. Her corporate training echoed in her mind. Compliance first. Policies protect the institution. Deviation is risk. But as she watched Shaq, Alyssa, and Henry, a new voice emerged. A quieter, unfamiliar voice that whispered about compassion, justice, and doing the right thing. Her internal conflict was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A young teller approached nervously. Ms. Harris? Some customers are asking questions about what just happened. They're saying it's unfair Mr. Sullivan was treated that way. Emily's stomach tightened. What are they asking? They want to know why someone with a spotless 40-year banking history was nearly denied access to his own money, the teller replied, her voice barely above a whisper. And honestly, I've been wondering the same thing. Meanwhile, Shaq turned back to the bank entrance, his gaze meeting Emily's through the glass. He gave Henry a reassuring pat on the shoulder and started walking toward her. Alyssa followed, still holding her phone. Emily straightened her blazer instinctively as Shaq re-entered the building, his imposing figure filling the lobby. The quiet murmurs of the remaining customers hushed as Shaq approached Emily. He stopped just short of her, his deep voice breaking the silence. Ms. Harris, I think it's time we had a conversation. Emily's heart pounded as she nodded and gestured toward her office. Of course, Mr. O'Neal. Please come in. Inside the office, the tension was thick. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his large hands resting on the edge of the desk. Alyssa stood by the door, her camera still rolling. Ms. Harris, Shaq began, his voice measured but firm. You seem like a smart, capable manager. But today, you let policies come before people. You almost let a man leave here without the money he needed to save his wife's life. Why? Emily hesitated, the words catching in her throat. Finally, she said, It's not that simple, Mr. O'Neal. These policies are in place to protect customers. They prevent fraud, especially against seniors. Shaq nodded slightly. I get that. Fraud is real and policies are important. But you know what else is real? Coach Sullivan's 40 years of loyalty, his spotless record, his need for help today, not next week or next month. When did this bank stop trusting the people who trust it? Emily glanced at her tablet, the bright red warnings from the bank's compliance system still flashing on the screen. She sighed deeply. I don't make the rules, Mr. O'Neal. These policies come from corporate, and they don't leave room for exceptions. If I break them, I risk my job. Shaq leaned back, his expression softening slightly. I understand that, Ms. Harris. I know the pressure you're under. But let me ask you this. What's the cost of not breaking the rules when it means doing the right thing? What happens when banks forget they're supposed to serve their communities? Alyssa chimed in, her youthful voice cutting through the weight of the conversation. Dad always says that the strongest people are the ones who stand up when it's hardest. You had a chance to stand up for Mr. Sullivan today, and you finally did. But it shouldn't have taken a scene like this to make it happen. Emily looked at Alyssa, the teenager's words hitting her harder than Shaq's towering presence. For the first time, she saw the situation from a different perspective. Not as a manager trying to enforce policies, but as a human being with the power to make a difference. The silence that followed was broken by a knock on the office door. A senior customer stepped in hesitantly, her voice trembling. Ms. Harris, I just wanted to say, what happened to Mr. Sullivan isn't right. I've been banking here for years, and if someone like him can't get help, what chance do the rest of us have? Emily's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. I'm going to make sure this never happens again. As Shaq and Alyssa left the office, Emily remained seated, her mind racing. She opened her email and began drafting a message to corporate, outlining the need for policy changes that prioritized compassion and community over rigid compliance. In the lobby, Shaq approached Henry, who was now surrounded by supportive customers. He placed a hand on Henry's shoulder and said, Coach, this isn't just about today. You've inspired change, and that's something money can't buy. Henry smiled, his gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you, Shaq, for everything. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry stood, gripping his cane tightly. I'd better get home to Margaret. She's waiting for her medication. Shaq extended his hand to shake Henry's. You take care, Coach, and if you ever need anything, you know who to call. Henry smiled warmly. Same to you, big guy. You've got a coach in your corner now. Alyssa watched as the two men shook hands, her heart swelling with pride. Dad, this was incredible, she said as they walked toward their car. You really made a difference today. Shaq put an arm around her shoulders. It wasn't just me, Alyssa. It was all of us, standing up for each other, doing what's right. That's what being part of a community means. As Henry drove away, clutching the envelope tightly in his lap, he glanced in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the world. And as Shaq and Alyssa got into their car, Alyssa turned on her phone's camera one more time. Dad, what should I say in the post? Shaq grinned. Say this. Sometimes the biggest assists happen off the court. Stand up for what's right and you can change someone's life. The soft hum of the car engine filled the silence as Shaquille O'Neal and Alyssa drove away from Centennial Savings Bank. The glow of the streetlights reflected on the windshield as the father and daughter exchanged quiet smiles, the weight of the day's events settling over them. In the back seat, Alyssa was editing the final touches of her video, determined to share Coach Henry Sullivan's story with the world. You think it's enough, Dad? Alyssa asked, glancing up from her phone. Shaq chuckled, his deep voice resonating in the car. Kid, it's not about how many likes or shares it gets. It's about the people who see it and decide to do something. That's the real win. Alyssa nodded thoughtfully, her fingers hovering over the post button. With a quick tap, the video went live. Within moments, notifications began pouring in. Comments, likes, and shares from people moved by the story. Alyssa's grin widened as she read some of the early responses. Meanwhile, Henry Sullivan was on his way home, the envelope of cash still resting in his lap. The weight of the day's struggles felt lighter now, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. When he pulled into the driveway of his modest home, he saw the warm glow of the living room light spilling through the window. Inside, his wife Margaret sat in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her knees. Henry entered the house, clutching the envelope tightly. Margaret looked up, her tired eyes lighting up with relief when she saw him. "You got it?" she asked softly. Henry nodded, his voice steady. "I got it, Margaret. And I had a little help along the way." Meanwhile, Shaq and Alyssa were back at home, watching the story unfold on social media. The video Alyssa had posted the night before had gone viral, shared across platforms and picked up by local news outlets. The hashtag #EHumanityOverPolicy was trending, and people across the country were sharing their own stories of bureaucratic struggles and triumphs. Alyssa looked up at her dad, pride shining in her eyes. "You know you're a hero, right?" Shaq shook his head, his voice soft. "I'm not a hero, Alyssa. I just did what anyone should do, stand up when something's not right." The story of Henry Sullivan, Shaquille O'Neal, and the day humanity triumphed over bureaucracy quickly became the talk of the town, and far beyond. By the morning after Alyssa posted her video, the hashtag #HumanityOverPolicy had gone viral, sparking debates on social media and national news networks. People everywhere were sharing their own experiences of facing corporate indifference, and the story resonated deeply with audiences of all ages. The boardroom at Centennial Savings headquarters was abuzz with activity. Executives, typically accustomed to quarterly earnings reports and compliance reviews, found themselves grappling with a public relations crisis. A team of analysts tracked the story's online traction, noting how quickly it was spreading. News outlets had picked up the video, and it was impossible to ignore the wave of public support for Henry Sullivan. At the center of the room sat Rebecca Marks, the CEO of Centennial Savings. A sharp, no-nonsense leader, she watched the viral video in silence, her expression growing graver with each passing second. When it ended, she addressed the room. "This is a wake-up call," she said firmly. "We've let automation and policy become walls between us and our customers. It's time we tear those walls down." Rebecca immediately convened a meeting with her senior staff, instructing them to overhaul the bank's customer service policies. Within hours, the bank issued a formal apology, acknowledging the failure of their systems to address Henry's urgent needs. "Centennial Savings exists to serve our customers," the statement read. "And yesterday, we failed to do so. Effective immediately, we are reviewing and revising our policies to ensure no one else faces unnecessary barriers to accessing their own funds. We owe our customers and our community better." The apology was accompanied by an announcement. A new customer advocacy division would be created to address cases like Henry's, focusing on accessibility and support for elderly and underserved populations. At the local branch, Emily Harris became something of a celebrity in her own right. Initially hesitant about the decision she had made, Emily was surprised when Rebecca Marks reached out to commend her courage. "It's not easy to defy protocol," Rebecca told her in a private call, "but you reminded us that sometimes doing what's right means challenging the status quo. I want you to lead the new customer advocacy division." Emily was floored. What had begun as one of the most stressful days of her career had transformed into an opportunity to enact real change. She accepted the position with a renewed sense of purpose, vowing to ensure the bank never overlooked its humanity again. Meanwhile, in the small town where Henry and Margaret lived, the story was the subject of every conversation. Neighbors stopped by the Sullivan house to drop off meals, offer support, and simply let the couple know they weren't alone. The local high school basketball team, where Henry had coached for decades, dedicated their next game to him. Before tip-off, the announcer shared the story of how Coach Sullivan had fought to get his wife the medication she needed, with help from Shaquille O'Neal. The crowd erupted into cheers, standing in solidarity with the man who had given so much to the community. Henry, though overwhelmed by the attention, took the opportunity to reflect on his life. At a community gathering organized in his honor, he addressed the crowd with quiet humility. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," he began. "I just wanted to take care of Margaret. But if what happened to me helped someone else, then it was worth it. Sometimes we don't realize how much power we have to make a difference until we're forced to." The impact of the story extended far beyond Centennial Savings. Banks across the country began reassessing their policies, with many adopting changes to better support seniors and those unfamiliar with technology. Social media campaigns inspired by humanity over policy pushed institutions to prioritize compassion over rigid compliance. Local organizations in Henry's town launched programs to teach seniors how to navigate digital systems, bridging the gap between progress and accessibility. Volunteers stepped forward to assist with everything from setting up smartphones to understanding online banking. Weeks later, Shaq and Alyssa returned to Henry's town for a community event. Henry greeted them warmly, his gratitude evident in his wide smile. As they sat together at the local high school gym, Henry handed Shaq a framed photograph. A younger Henry coaching a teenage basketball player who would later go on to play professionally. "I thought you might like this," Henry said, chuckling. "You gave me a second chance, Shaq. It's the least I can do." Shaq took the photo, his expression softening. "Coach, you didn't just teach basketball. You taught life. And you're still teaching it today." The two men shook hands, the moment captured by Alyssa, who couldn't resist snapping another photo for her social media feed. The story of Henry Sullivan, Shaquille O'Neal, and the power of standing up for what's right became a testament to the difference one act of courage could make. It reminded the world that behind every policy, there's a person, and that sometimes all it takes to change the system is one voice refusing to be silenced. Sometimes the biggest victories aren't won on the court or in the boardroom. They're found in the quiet moments when someone chooses compassion over convenience. Henry Sullivan's story reminds us all of the power of standing up for those who can't fight for themselves. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more uplifting stories that show the best of humanity. What would you do if you were in Shaq's shoes, or Henry's? Tell us in the comments below and let's start a conversation about how we can all make a difference, one act of kindness at a time. See you in the next video.